They always taught me that love was a luxury, a prize earned after fulfilling every duty, after smiling at the right events, accepting imposed silences, keeping my chin high even when my heart begged for respite. I grew up in a world where value was measured by surnames, where every gesture was scrutinized, calculated, and any misstep was a scandal to be hushed. The Duskmere name was armor, respected, feared, but also suffocating. Being the daughter of that empire meant knowing from a young age that I didn't belong to myself. My image wasn't mine. My words had to be weighed before spoken. My tears, if they came, were to be shed in silence, behind walls that knew how to keep secrets. And so I learned to exist, spine straight, gaze distant, heart locked away. But there were days when the facade slipped. Alone, after endless meetings, I'd catch my reflection in the glass and barely recognize the woman staring back. Sometimes at night I wished to disappear. Not forever, not permanently, just for a while. Just long enough for someone to call me by my name, not my title. And it was on one of those days that he appeared, without warning, without reverence. He didn't know who I was, or if he did, he didn't show it mattered, and that unsettled me. I was used to gazes that weighed, words that bowed, smiles that carried agendas, but he didn't try to please me. He didn't try to win me. He simply saw me, and that was more dangerous than any political maneuver I'd ever witnessed, because being truly seen is a risk I'd never taken. And in that moment, despite all my rigidity, despite centuries of training embedded in my posture, I wavered. Inside, something faltered. A fragile thread pulled my body out of that cocoon, and though I tried to convince myself it was just a moment, just a glance, just chance, I already knew nothing would be the same. At first I kept my distance, out of pride, instinct, fear of myself. Being around him was like walking barefoot on ground that seemed too solid, and for that very reason suspicious. He didn't look at me with reverence or disdain. He wanted nothing from me. And yet there he was, always nearby, always present, like someone who didn't need a reason to stay. That disarmed me more than any direct confrontation. He didn't ask invasive questions, didn't probe my wounds, but I knew he sensed them. He saw in my silences what no one else did. And slowly, that began to eat away at me. I was taught to control, to hide, to protect every part of myself as if my soul were a battlefield in constant war. But near him, my walls began to crack, not from insistence, but from the absurd gentleness of his presence. He worked near the family's foundation lands, handled minor matters, logistics, practical things, everything we Duskmere never dirtied our hands with. And yet, there he was, tending to what was invisible to the nobility's eyes, but essential to keeping everything upright. Maybe that's what caught my attention first. The steadiness with which he inhabited the world. He needed no titles, expected, no recognition. He did what needed doing. And when our paths began crossing more than chance allowed, I found myself noticing too much. The way he spoke slowly but with precision. The way he laughed at simple things, as if unburdened by anything. I, who came from a dynasty where laughter was controlled, began to crave that sound every day. But I knew I couldn't. It was forbidden, unthinkable, unacceptable, and for that very reason, inevitable. We started talking by accident, a greeting. That turned into a question that turned into conversation. And at some point I realized I was looking for him with my eyes before admitting it to myself. He didn't treat me like a princess. He called me by my first name, as if it carried no weight, as if I were just me, and no one had ever given me that kind of freedom, to be just Alariel, without the signature of lineage, without the pose. And the more he saw me, the more I saw myself, for the first time. But I was still afraid, because deep down, I knew that, if we continued, the world around us wouldn't forgive. I tried to pull back. I swear I tried. I distanced myself, silenced our talks, avoided crossing his path in corridors that once felt too long and now too short to contain what was between us. But it was too late. Something had taken root. His presence lodged in the cracks of my days, in the way I heard his voice even in his absence, in the way my hand remembered his without ever truly holding it. And that's when I understood the danger was no longer him. The danger was what he awakened in me, the desire to be free. The whispers began when someone saw us talking near the lower gardens. It was innocent, at least to me. But to the Duskmere world, it was a violation, a threat. Suddenly doors began to close. Family meetings grew colder, more calculated. My name was quietly removed from events. My father started looking at me as if trying to decode a glitch in a well-crafted machine. My mother retreated behind her pearl necklaces and long glances, the kind that condemn without words. And I began to be treated like a foreigner in my own home, all because of something they didn't even understand, but felt. Because there's something in a woman's eyes when she begins to love in secret, and they saw. They always see. The punishment didn't come all at once. It came in sips, like air being taken away slowly. A privilege removed here, a cut in trust there, a subtle shift in treatment that screamed louder than any scandal. And then the fall, with a fabricated accusation, a claim of dishonor, a scandal sewn with precision, a forged signature, a fraudulent contract in my name. Overnight, I became the face of a mistake, and the entire structure that once held me up was used to crush me. I was exiled, disowned, silenced. My name, which once opened doors, became a whisper of shame. I left without a crown, without a home, without a future. None of those who smiled beside me in official photos spoke up. No political ally moved to defend me. I was disposable after all, replaceable, forgettable. But as I walked with blistered feet, shoulders bare of titles, my soul suspended between who I was and what remained, he appeared. He, the man who never wanted anything from me, except to see me, to be there. He found me when I no longer knew who I was. He offered his hand without asking anything, and there, between the end and the abyss, something survived. I had lost everything, except his love. I remember the silence, not the silence of the Duskmere's gilded halls, where every absence of sound was a performance, not the strategic silence of meetings, nor the cold silence of calculated glances. This was different. It was the silence of the fall, the muffled sound of someone who'd lost everything and suddenly hears only their own breathing, trying to convince themselves they're still alive. When he found me, I wasn't crying. There were no tears left. I was sitting on a forgotten bench in a city I barely knew, hands dirty, hair loose, eyes fixed on some point on the ground. There was no nobility left in me, none. And maybe that's why he saw me truly for the second time. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask what had happened. He just took off his coat and placed it over my shoulders as if we were returning from an ordinary dinner, as if that gesture weren't an act of rescue. He walked beside me in silence for long minutes until he stopped before a simple door, pushed it open with his foot, and motioned for me to enter. I hesitated. It was like crossing an invisible threshold, leaving behind not just a life, but the entire narrative that told me who I was. And yet I entered, because I was tired, and because deep down I had nowhere else to go. The first days were almost unreal. He lived simply, but there was warmth in the details. The dry towel left for me, the plate he served in silence, the couch where he let me sleep even when his eyes were heavy with exhaustion. He didn't treat me like a victim, nor like a fallen princess. He treated me like someone who still had value, even without anything the world recognized as such. And that, more than any words, began to rebuild parts of me I didn't know existed. At first I barely spoke, I just observed. The way he tidied the house, how he cared for small gestures, how he lived without haste. A man without a crown, without lineage, but with a quiet strength that was almost disconcerting. He never demanded anything from me, didn't ask for explanations, didn't require promises. He just stayed. And it was that permanence that hurt most, because it healed. I was no longer Alariel Duskmere, and I didn't yet know who I was without that name. But beside him, I realized this might be my chance to find out. I started sweeping the floor on the third morning, without asking, without thinking. It was just a way to keep my hands busy, while my mind still struggled to accept that this place, simple and without gold on the walls, was now my home. He didn't say anything, just watched from afar, with that half-smile that neither judged nor celebrated, it simply welcomed. And that's when I realized I was letting myself exist there, without a mask, without a role, with nothing to prove. For the first time, I wasn't an heir to anything, and paradoxically, it was in that emptiness that something inside me began to bloom. He left early every day and returned in the late afternoon, hands marked by work. I watched him, the way he hung his coat, how he cared for things with diligence, how he treated neighbors with effortless kindness. It was a different world from the one I knew. No cold corridors or judgmental eyes. Here, everything was small but honest. And slowly, I found my place. I started cooking for him, hesitantly. I picked up forgotten books from the shelves and read sitting on the floor, barefoot. I felt ashamed the first time he saw me like that. Hair, tied haphazardly, no makeup, wearing an old shirt of his as pajamas. But he just said, "You look more like you now." And those words stayed with me like a tattoo. In time, we started talking more. Not about the past, not yet, but about small things. Food, old movies, the sound of rain on the roof. And it was in those details that I realized we were building something. It wasn't overwhelming passion. It wasn't escape. It was tenderness. A kind of love that grows slowly like roots in new soil. And even with all the fear still living in me, I no longer wanted to leave. I started sleeping on the left side of the bed, hanging my coat beside his, forgetting to ask how long I could stay. Because deep down, I already knew. I had stayed, but it wasn't all simple. There were days when the name Duskmere returned like a ghost, in nightmares, in distant news, in memories that made me close my eyes and forget for a moment where I was. And he noticed. He didn't ask, but he stayed, made tea, sat beside me in silence. And one night when I woke gasping from a bad dream, he just held me. And that's when I cried for the first time since everything fell. I cried for all I'd lost, for the woman I was, for the girl who was never allowed to exist. And he, with a steady hand on my back, only whispered, "You're safe now." The next morning, something in me had changed. I no longer needed a throne, needed him. The news came like an unwelcome whisper, a short message, passed on by someone who still remembered my name with reverence. "They're trying to clean the family's image. Your return could be useful." Cold, direct, as if I were a pawn being called back to the board after a strategic misstep. No apologies, no regret. Just self-interest. It was exactly the kind of offer the Duskmere made, cloaked in elegance, but empty of humanity. I read the message several times, then deleted it. then cried. Not out of longing, but anger. Because part of me still hoped for a gesture that would never come. They didn't want me back. They wanted what I could restore. They wanted me to silence everything I'd lived through and return to play the role that, to them, had never stopped being mine. But I was no longer that woman. And at the same time, I didn't yet know how to be another. I told him. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that resembled fear. Not jealousy, not distrust, but because he knew what that choice meant. He knew that if I said yes, there'd be no place for him in the world I came from. And yet, he didn't hold me back. Didn't beg, just asked, "Do you want to go back?" I stayed silent for long minutes. It was tempting to reclaim what I'd lost, the status, the comfort, the recognition, but it would come at the cost of everything that had saved me, at the cost of myself. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on my back, listening to his breathing, feeling the space between us like an unasked question, until without warning, I turned and rested my forehead on his chest. He didn't move, just wrapped his arms around me, and I whispered, "I was raised to be theirs, but I choose to be mine, and if I can, I choose to be yours too." He didn't reply with words, just held me tighter. And I knew. The answer was there. The next morning I replied to the message with 2 words. "Don't contact me." And for the first time in my life, I felt I'd made a decision that was truly mine. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale after my choice. There were no fireworks, no permanent peace waiting on the other side of the decision. What there was him, and that was enough. We stayed in the small house, with windows that creaked on windy days and old furniture he refused to replace. I found myself cleaning corners with more care, cooking with more joy, hanging flowers on the porch as my way of saying, I stayed. And I had stayed, not just in that place, but in that life. A life made of reality, of now, of imperfections that no longer needed hiding. I started working discreetly, without making a fuss about who I'd been. I used my real name only in the silence of memory. To the neighbors, I was just Alariel, nothing more. And for the first time, that was enough. Slowly, I realized people didn't expect anything from me. They didn't demand performance. They didn't expect perfection. They just wanted to know if I was okay. And that kind of everyday kindness moved me more than any applause from the past. He remained the same, simple, direct, but attentive to what mattered. He spent his days at work, came back with marked hands and a full smile. And every night, before sleep, he touched my face with the same lightness of someone grateful I was still there. I began to understand that love isn't a fire that consumes. It's a warmth that sustains. It's not grand gestures or great deeds. It's knowing that if I sit on the curb and can't say a word, he'll sit beside me, without haste, without questions, just stay. And when I realized it, I no longer missed what I'd left behind. Not the glamour, not the titles, not the halls where everyone smiled without listening. What filled me now was the routine. The morning he forgot to buy bread and came back laughing with a pack of crackers. The afternoon we painted a wall together, even though we didn't know what we were doing. The way he said my name, without reverence, but with tenderness. The Duskmere world now felt like a story I'd lived in another body, as if I'd been loaned to that past, but finally returned to myself. And looking at him, as he dozed on the couch with a book open on his chest, I knew I wasn't a fallen princess. I was a whole woman, and he was the only kingdom I still wished to inhabit. It wasn't a perfect life. There were overdue bills, nights when exhaustion spoke louder than affection, moments when the silence between us wasn't peace, it was distance. But even that was real. And true love, I discovered, doesn't flee those places. It steps in with you. There were days when he came home irritated, wordless, and I stayed quiet, not out of submission, but out of respect for his space. There were mornings when I woke with a weight in my chest, memories of the past still visiting, and he touched me lightly, saying nothing, as if to say, "I'm here when you're ready to come back." And so, without grand gestures, without movie lines, we kept choosing each other. I started noticing how much he was part of everything. He was in the smells of the house, the music I now listened to, the objects piling up in corners like small markers of our daily life. His was the mug I used for morning coffee. His was the coat I wore when the wind picked up. It was for him I learned recipes, opened my eyes slowly on Sundays, smiled with less fear. And once, when he was late coming, home without warning, I felt an emptiness that chilled me to the bone, not from insecurity, but because, without him, the house lost its sound. It was as if part of my breathing had gone for a walk and hadn't returned. He came back hours later with a tired smile and crooked flowers in his hands, said he saw them on the way and thought of me, and I, without thinking, hugged him with a strength that surprised even me. I realized then how much I loved him. Not as you love a hero, but as you love a harbor, a shelter. He didn't save me from myself. He stayed while I saved myself, little by little. We started making plans. Not grand ones, small, everyday ones. A room renovation, a short trip, a pet maybe. We talked about it between laughter and lists scribbled on the backs of old envelopes. And somehow that was nobler than any ceremony I'd known in the palace. It was real life, real conquest, love with presence. The woman who once wore gala dresses and smiled for soulless cameras now smiled barefoot, hair tied haphazardly, sitting beside a man who didn't promise the world, but gave me a place in it. And if that wasn't a happy ending, then maybe the fairy tales had been telling it wrong all along. One morning, as I watched the sun slip slowly through the curtain slats, I realized how much had changed, not around me, but within me. I still had memories of the palace, flashes of the ballroom where I was presented to society, the weight of jewels worn as armor, the rehearsed speeches I learned to repeat without feeling. But now those memories didn't hurt. They were distant, almost as if they belonged to another woman. Alariel Duskmere still existed, but only as part of the story, not the protagonist. He walked into the room, sleepy, hair mussed, eyes half lost. He saw me, smiled, sat beside me and placed his hand on my leg with a naturalness so intimate, so honest it pierced me with profound tenderness. This was the life I'd chosen, not out of necessity but love. A love built in the rubble of the fall. A love that didn't ask me to be anything but who I was. Later, as we folded freshly washed clothes, he looked at me with that way of his, thinking before speaking, and said, "You know I would have loved you even if you'd gone back, right?" I nodded slowly. "But I wouldn't have loved myself if I'd gone back." He smiled and kept folding. The answer was enough. The house wasn't big. There was no luxury, no guaranteed security or public recognition. But there was peace. There was listening. There was us, building a life from the inside out, without armor, without stages, just presence. Sometimes love doesn't win with shouts. It wins with silence, with constancy, with small choices made day after day. It wins when, after losing everything, you understand that what stayed is exactly what could never be taken. And that's how I discovered I was a princess who lost everything, but gained what I never had, and in the end, his love was all that remained, and all I needed. Years passed, and the woman once molded to wear a crown now uses her hands to tend a small garden behind the house. Nails dirty with earth, hair loose in the wind, an easy smile. No one would recognize her. And maybe that's the greatest sign of victory. She no longer needs to be seen. She just needs to be. He's still there, by her side. Not as a prince, but as a partner. Not as a savior, but as a mirror. They age slowly between silent coffees and memories that need no words. Sometimes she still wakes startled, thinking it was all a dream. But he's there, breathing nearby. And that's enough. She didn't rebuild an empire. She rebuilt herself. And discovered at last that love isn't what they place on you to perform. Love is what lets you live, even after the fall.